Hello, my name is Dr. Ruby Gibson. I'm the developer of somatic archaeology, and my focus is on historical trauma recovery. And one of the very important things that shows up for us with historical trauma are the residential schools that were established in the United States and Canada in order to kill the Indian in the child. And I wanted to tell you a story about a dear friend of mine who experienced this. So thank you for your time and for listening. I call this the first piece. The first piece is a poem by Black Elk, Oglala Sioux, man, wise man. And he writes, the first piece, which is the most important, is that which comes within the souls of men when they realize their relationship, their oneness with the universe and all of its powers. And when they realize that at the center of the universe dwells Wakantanka, or our Creator, and that this center is really everywhere, it's within each of us, this is the real peace. And the others are but reflections of this. The second piece is that which is made between two individuals. And the third piece is that which is made between two nations. But above all, you should understand that there can never be peace between nations until there is first known the true peace, which I have often said is within the souls of men. That's Black Elk. And then I begin here. It was the autumn of 1962 when 5-year-old Ivan Paul and his 6 brothers and sisters were taken from their home to attend the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School in Nova Scotia. It's the same year that John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth, JFK was president, and Adolf Eichmann was hanged for his role in the Holocaust. Black student James Meredith was blocked from enrolling at the University of Mississippi, and later he was admitted. This was also the same year that the Caribbean nations of Trinidad and Tobago became independent within the British Commonwealth. And the very same year that Linus Carr Pauling was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for campaigning ceaselessly, not only against nuclear weapons and tests and the spread of these armaments, but against all warfare as a means of solving international conflicts. By all accounts, we appear to be a civilized group of rational and intelligent human beings, a group growing and striving toward economic freedom and human rights. Slavery has been dead for years. Bell Telephone just launched the first private communications satellite, and a NASA X-15 can fly at 4,105 miles per hour. Amazing the progress that we've made over the past 100 years, not only scientifically, but also socially and politically, right? Well, then how could it be possible that amidst this civilization of ours, that an estimated 125,000 Native children were passed through Canada's Indian residential system, along with young Ivan Paul? Led by a governmental plan to assimilate Indigenous people and their way of life into the mainstream, these innocent children were forcibly taken from their homes, transported to large church-run institutions, disrobed of their dignity, required to develop cultural amnesia, ordered not to speak their language or practice their religion. They were sexually molested, physically abused, mentally tortured, and spiritually raped. And if that was not enough, they were asked to endure it all with appreciation and respect for their captors, captors whose sole intent was to save their savage souls from a primitive lifestyle that would no doubt secure their passage to hell. Did you say it was 1962? When Ivan Paul arrived at the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School, he immediately knew that it was a terrible place. He was lined up with other children, and the priest told them they were dirty savages. They cut Ivan's hair until he was almost bald and scrubbed him hard with a steel brush. He was separated from his brothers and sisters. Whenever he spoke his native language, the only language he had ever spoken, he would receive 20 lashes and have a big bar of soap stuck in his mouth. They told him he was speaking heathen and devil language. He was never allowed to receive anything from the outside world and was beaten if he left the yard. He had so little contact with anyone outside of the school, and he was only allowed to see his parents once a year for 1 hour. A priest would come every night into the dormitory and take a child. Many times it was little Ivan Paul. At the age of 5, he was forced to perform oral sex and then sodomized. It was so frightening and painful that he simply froze inside. He became violently sick afterwards and was punished and whipped with a horsewhip and not allowed to speak. He went into a catatonic state, and for about a year afterward, he stopped talking. But he had to learn to say the Hail Mary prayer. He was forced to stay on his knees, repeating this prayer over and over until his knees bled. He got used to being beaten every morning and every evening. He thought that was the way it was supposed to be. And he wondered how such terrible things could be done to children in the name of God. I'm wondering the same thing. Where was the rest of the world while this was happening? How could the Catholic Church and much less the Canadian government get away with all of this in broad daylight? It's been centuries since the English first imposed themselves on the Aboriginal peoples of North America, drawing political boundaries, wiping out native nations with epidemics and war. stealing land and water rights, and tirelessly attempting to instigate religious control. History books recall this domination with prejudice, echoing a cultural superiority and a vain sense of appropriateness with which the English were able to exercise this amount of control. Their need for power sidestepped common decency and any religious morality I've ever heard of. I believe the term savage has been mislaid in this instance. We have come to expect a margin of error in our human evolvement. As a species, we tend to view our ancestors as uneducated peoples who took to extremes, especially in times when survival took precedence over virtue, and have been able to justify their historical actions with claims of ignorance. There are a few things, though, that have no basis for justification. One of them is cultural genocide. It's something we've never been able to fathom in our collective history and hearts. It chips away at the cornerstone of human decency and enlightened learning that we typically hail as the qualities that set us apart from our animal brothers and sisters. Ivanhoe's tribe, the Mi'kmaq, one of the First Nations people, have been living in the land called Atlantic Canada for at least 2,000 years or more. They were skilled hunter-gatherers with a heavy emphasis on fishing and sea mammals. The Mi'kmaq were semi-nomadic, bound together as a loose confederacy through a common system of patrilineal clans. Peaceful and generous. In 1611, Pierre Bayard recalled this about the Mi'kmaq. They are in no way ungrateful to each other and share everything. No one would dare to refuse the request of another, not to eat without giving him part of what he has. Once considered essential partners in the fur trade by white settlers, by the late 1800s, the First Nations people were viewed as a nuisance in the path of progress. As a group, they were considered easily converted by the Jesuits, prime candidates for cultural genocide. Cultural genocide, defined by the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948, means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. And those include killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction, in whole or part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. More than 80 residential schools for Native children were set up in the past century in almost every province in Canada. Officials estimate that 125,000 Native children passed through the system before it was closed in the mid-1980s. A cabinet minister expressed the government's philosophy in 1883, and I quote, "If these residential schools are to succeed, We must not have them too near the bands. In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. I invite you to take a minute and think about your own children and being put in this type of position, being separated and completely losing touch with anything familiar. There is a high mortality rate among pupils of these harsh church-run institutions, and parents allege that youngsters were overworked, poorly fed, and subject to corporal punishment, which native societies didn't inflict on children. These schools were designed, according to newspaper articles, to kill the Indian in the child, to assimilate Indians and eradicate their culture. Sounds like cultural genocide to me. What do you think? So you've got to ask yourself, why would a government or church engage in the process of genocide? Common sense tells me that greed would be the propeller hidden in the waters of self-righteousness. But it seems far more complicated than that. Ward Churchill, quoted here from a passage in One Spirit, One People by Stephen Buhner, says that, and I quote, "The genocide of a people occurs in 3 stages. In the first stage, the destroying culture engages in acts of violence." That's been done. When violence has achieved its intended goal of domination, the destroying culture begins to engage in activities to assimilate and civilize the savage, such as prohibiting indigenous language, religion, and education. Finally, the dominant group absorbs the dominated group to the extent that it owns the group's truth and knowledge. End of quote. At this point, the dominated group has been absorbed into the dominating group so deeply that its cultural values, aspects, elements, and expressions are part of the dominant group. Are we sure that we are ready to see the final stages of genocide enacted? The first 2 stages are already history. The third would render our First Nations cultures extinct. It's no longer 1962. The government and church has had their margin of error again and again. In the advent of this new century, examples of our involvement must be demonstrative. Our actions must match our wisdom. We must heed the warning in the old Navajo saying, "If you kill off the prairie dogs, there will be no one to cry for the rain." The good news is that there's already been some intervention. Rudy James of the International Human Rights Association of American Minorities, an organization asked by the United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights to investigate potential human rights abuse connected to the residential school system, determined that an inquiry into the system and Canada's treatments of the victims of this system were inappropriate. The human rights infractions that Canada, several churches, organizations, and individuals associated with the schools need to address are the forced removal of Aboriginal people from traditional lands and water, institutional racism, psychological warfare, genocide, and murder. In response, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was established in 1991. They released a comprehensive report that spans 5 volumes and 3,500 pages and makes 440 recommendations. The report contained arguments and conclusions such as the following, and I quote, "Now, in any large organization, isolated incidences of abuse may occur, and such abuses may have occurred in some Indian residential schools. In any event, individuals who attended residential schools now appear to be suffering low self-esteem, alcoholism, somatic disorders, violent histories, and other symptoms of psychological distress, commonly named as residential school syndrome. While these symptoms seem endemic to Aboriginal peoples in general and not limited to those who attended residential schools, this is likely to come about because successive generations of attendees passed along, as it were, their personal psychological problems to their homes, communities, perpetuating the symptomology, if not the syndrome." End of quote. Although we witness here an intentional blindness on the part of the government as to their inability to recognize the accumulative effects of hundreds of years of being oppressed, the Minister of Indian Affairs, Jane Stewart, attempts reconciliation. In her address in Ottawa, Ontario, on January 7, 1998, Ms. Stewart states, and I quote, "The main policy direction pursued for more than 150 years, first by colonial and then by Canadian governments, has been wrong. The Government of Canada recognizes that the policies that sought to assimilate Aboriginal people, women and men, boys and girls, were not the way to build a strong community. We must instead continue to find ways in which Aboriginal people can participate fully in economic, political, cultural, and social life of Canada in a manner which preserves and enhances collective identities of Aboriginal communities and allows them to evolve and flourish in the future." End of quote. She calls for a 20-year process of renewal, which includes strengthening Aboriginal government, creating new fiscal relationships, and economic development. The federal government of Canada has committed $350 million to an Aboriginal Healing Foundation for community-based healing as a first step to deal with the legacy of residential schools. As of March 31st, 2003, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation had approved 1,059 projects with various Aboriginal organizations and communities. The value of the contracts was $266 million. The Canadian government, though, still drags their heels when it comes to compensating individuals for the pain and suffering they have endured. It's estimated that in 2003, there are about 90,000 living survivors of residential schools. According to the federal government, only 10 to 12% of former students of residential schools have actually filed lawsuits claiming abuse and loss of culture. As of late 2002, the Anglican Church was named in 20% of the 12,000 unsettled claims of abuse in residential schools. In settlements averaging about $100,000, an average of one lawsuit a day was being settled as of March 2003. To speed up settlements for claimants, the Anglican Church and Ottawa signed a deal in 2003. Under the plan, the Anglican Church, which has gone bankrupt, compensating survivors for their claims, will pay $25 million into a fund which will cover up to 30% of the claims. The federal government will pay the other 70%. Other Canadian churches are still negotiating with the government. But how do you ever repay someone for a lost childhood, for a battered heart, for the loss of the fundamental birthright to freedom? How do you forgive the unforgivable? As Black Elk so eloquently reminds us, it's the first peace which must be made before peace can be made between nations. The first peace for any individual recovering from suffering is empowerment and control over one's daily existence, or having a voice, having a choice, and having power. Unfortunately, in this day and age, control over one's existence is dependent on financial resources. Money, albeit a shallow form of restitution, is an exchange of power, a benefit that's a soothing balm for a wound that has festered over many, many years of neglect. The first peace also comes with a sense of justice, a vindication of responsibility. The Canadian government has come to the table. Although tardy, they're making a legitimate effort. But what about the churches? There are well over 100 lawsuits pending right now against churches for their role in the schools. Demands from the First Nations chiefs ask that the Pope apologize for violations on behalf of the Catholic Church. We heard the Pope apologize in March 2003 to the many Indigenous peoples who have been mistreated by the Church. But the Catholic Church has yet to accept responsibility for the part they played in the residential school system. The current issue for the Mi'kmaq people is reconciliation from the Catholic Church. Unfortunately, the Church is hiding behind a veil of bureaucracy. Verbal validation of wrongs committed and individual financial restitution would go a long way in creating that first peace. The first peace, surely, though, is not solely the occupation of the oppressed. It is required by both oppressed and oppressor. Stephen Buhner, once again in his book, sums up the concept for achieving the first peace, and I quote, "One of the basic preludes to finding that peace within our own hearts is to forgive and heal our ancestors. Then when we come to make peace between nations, our ancestors will not be crying and we will not be feeling shame for them. The dignity of the Mi'kmaq ancestors lives on today in the courageous acts of the abused children who have grown up to defend themselves. For Ivan Paul, the ability to actualize his dreams and see the pendulum of justice swing ever so slightly in his favor, especially within his own generation, is actualization of the belief of the sacred hoop of life. Everything the power of the world does is done in the circle. To see resolution come full circle within a lifetime is an amazing feat. The Mi'kmaq people and their ancestors owe it to a fierceness of sentiment. Sadly, our history with respect to the treatment of Indigenous people is not something in which anyone can take pride. Attitudes of racial and cultural superiority led to a suppression of Indigenous culture and values. As countries, we are burdened by past actions that resulted in weakening the identity of Indigenous peoples, suppressing their languages and cultures and outlawing their spiritual practices. We must reconcile the impact of these actions on the once self-sustaining nations that were disaggregated, disrupted, limited, or even destroyed by the dispossession of traditional territory, by the relocation of Aboriginal people, and by some provisions of the Indian Act. We must acknowledge the results of these actions, which were primarily the erosion of a political, economical, and social system of Indigenous people and nations. Against the backdrop of these historical legacies is a remarkable tribute to the strength and endurance of Indigenous people, that they have remained and maintained their historic diversity and identity. The Government of Canada today formally expresses to all Aboriginal people in Canada their profound regret for past actions of the federal government, which have contributed to these difficult pages in the history of our relationship together, particularly to those individuals who experienced the tragedy of physical and sexual assault at residential schools and have carried this burden, believing that in some way they may be responsible, that they're carrying the shame of their abuser. And I want to emphasize that what you experienced was not your fault, and it should have never happened to you. To those of you who suffered this tragedy at residential schools, I'm so deeply sorry that this experience happened, not only in Canada, but across the United States. Our Native people have suffered many things, but the residential school system could have broken our backs, but it didn't. We're still thriving. We're still cleaning up the internal messes and memories of those days. If this is the first time you're hearing about these things, please become active. The Native American Boarding School Coalition is doing all it can with Congress and in the United States to help create that same apology that Canada gave to its Indigenous people. That apology has never happened in the United States and is surely beyond the time when it was appropriate. But it's still there. It's still lingering. And I invite all of us to promote recovery and healing for the peoples who were the land keepers, the earth keepers of the places where you stand, where you live, where you swim, where you play. Please keep this in mind. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening. Mitako Yasin for all our relations. Aho.